It's my pleasure this week on this episode of the State Secrets podcast to welcome Shawn Wiswesser. Now, Shawn is a former senior CIA operations officer, which, at the Cypher Brief, we work with a lot of those folks every day. What really sets Shawn apart, I would say, from a lot of folks, is his knowledge and understanding of Russian operations. And we're going to dig into that with him today. Shawn, welcome to the State Secrets podcast.
Well, thank you, Suzanne. It's an honor to be with you and to be joined in Cypher Brief as a new contributing writer. So thank you so much.
We are glad to have you among the experts that we talk with regularly here at the Cypher Brief, Shawn. I want to introduce you to sort of our Cypher Brief audience as well. You haven't had a super public profile before now. Tell us a little bit about your career in the intelligence agency at CIA and why you were interested in this. Like, what prompted your interest in becoming both an intelligence officer as an analyst and then as an operations officer?
Yeah, I think a good place to start is with Russian language. So I started Russian. I went to a boarding school for boys. We had a great language program. I had a chance to start learning Russian. I was 13 years old, and my professor there, his name was Rick Borger. I'm going to mention him because he was such an important part of my life. For 4 years, I studied Russian with him, and this was still a time of the Soviet Union, and so I had a keen interest in Soviet Union and Russia. I thought at the time, I wanted a military career. Thought it was good to know the language of our adversaries. So I continued on. I studied history at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, but I got a second BA in Russian because I'd placed into third year Russian. All those 4 years of working with my high school teacher paid off. And then I studied abroad. I was in Russia 4 different times at university. And Suzanne, what struck me the most from those years, Russia was struggling in the early 90s to try to have a functioning democracy. I don't think they never succeeded. I don't think they really got a taste for it, but they were trying. And I came away from the studies abroad and being in that part of the world, traveling so much. I traveled a lot in the Donbass, by the way. I traveled in eastern Ukraine because I studied in Rostov-on-Don in the south. So I came away with a profound respect for Russian people, their culture, their history, their traditions. I still have that. My wife, by the way, is half Russian. Her father's Russian. She's Lithuanian on the other half. So what disappointed me, though, Suzanne, was how repressive the regime was. Even in the 1990s, you could still see the fear of the KGB and then the FSB in society. And the Russian people in their history, they've always suffered from this darker side of their security services repressing the people. So when I was interested in serving in the government, first with the Foreign Service and then with CIA, my goal was to try to help the Russian people and help them with democracy. So that's what inspired me.
That's so fascinating. Well, I'm just wondering, your wife is obviously half Russian, but you were interested in it long before you met her, I assume. So was there anything from your
Yeah.
childhood that sparked that interest in wanting to take Russian as a 13-year-old?
Well, my mom did find something. I had kept a journal as a kid. 6 years old, I wrote in one of my first journal entries ever. I said I want to be a G-man when I grow up. So I guess there was, I was very self-aware though at a young age. I was watching NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw when I was like 10 years old, watching it every night. I remember, and Suzanne, you probably recall those days. The Kremlin was always on the nightly news programs. It was always dark. It was always dark in Russia because of the time change, of course. But the nightly news programs, I think Garrett Utley was one of those broadcasting from the Kremlin. It's always dark in Moscow. So that had an impression on me, keep me up on current events. But again, there was always a respect for the Russian people. Even today, I know we're going to talk about my book later. I make a point in the very dedication of my book, we're in a secret war with Putin because he declared war on the West. We're not at war with the Russian people. I have profound respect. My own sons have Russian blood and Ukrainian blood in their veins. My wife's part Ukrainian as well. So, but their government has been repressive, and their government and their security services have always, the Russian people has always been the ones that suffer the most from their own regime and its oppression over the centuries. So.
Shawn, this is kind of a big question, just to jump right in with, but it's easy for America to think that the rest of the world would benefit and thrive when it comes to democracy. But do you think that's something that the average Russian is even interested in?
Yeah, it's a very good question, Suzanne. It's one I spent a lot of time talking with Russians about. So I've lived better part of a decade I spent in the former Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, that part of the world. As I mentioned, I traveled to Russia 4 different times as a student for over a year in university. I don't believe that the current generation of Russians and even their parents' generation, my wife's parents in the former Soviet Union, I don't think they have a good concept of democracy, with the exclusion of the Baltics, of course. So the Baltic countries are full functioning democracies and integrated into NATO and the European Union. But a lot of the rest of the former Soviet Union have been left out of that. Ukraine is a democracy, but one struggling, as we see in the headlines. They're certainly struggling still with corruption. That's a legacy of the Soviet Union. Corruption was bred into every aspect of the Soviet Union, in particular its intelligence services. So I think it's difficult for your average Russian to and citizens of the other republics of the former Soviet Union, for many of them to understand really democracy and have appreciation for the history like we do in the United States, 250 years of our democracy. And we're not perfect. We make a lot of mistakes. The Russian security services are very good at in their propaganda now and their lack of freedom. They're constantly playing on the vulnerabilities of democracies in the West, the fact that we allow freedom of the press. And so the Russians are fed a constant, steady stream. I still listen to Russian news. I watch it as much as I can get around. There is censorship and things to get around. How much is getting out to the West? I try to watch it, and it's right out of 1930s Nazi Germany. It really is 100% force fed from the Putin regime. And so your average Russian today, when they're asked if they want democracy or if they appreciate or understand democracy, I don't think they have any concept at all, Suzanne. It's very unfortunate. And there was a key period, I believe, in the 1990s when I was traveling there as a student. We had a chance, but we backed some of the wrong quote reformers in Russia too, that were really out for their own wallets and back pockets, corrupt, and that hurt, I think, as well. So, but yeah, I still hope for the Russian people, for them to be able to have democracy. But it's a key question when we try to understand their mentality, how they look at the West, how they view us.
Yeah, and Russia doesn't have freedom of the press. It's mostly
Exactly not.
state-run media in Russia. I say mostly. So, like, help us think through, what does it look like versus like a regular newscast? You said you grew up listening to Tom Brokaw in the United States versus what an
Yeah.
average Russian would
Yeah.
see on the nightly news. Is it news or is it propaganda?
Yeah, so right now, past, particularly, it's been getting worse for decades. But what they're seeing now on the newscasts every night in Russian, Orte, one of their big news programs, the others that they have, Suzanne, they're fed a constant stream of forced propaganda. NATO started this war in Ukraine, this fascist war. The very idea that they can call President Zelensky, who has Jewish ancestry, whose own ancestors were persecuted, um, that doesn't matter. The force-fed line from the regime is that NATO and Ukraine started this war, and the Russian people, it's all they've heard now. Certainly, going back more than 4 years prior to the start of the war, Putin's line was that Ukraine was never a country, and that those parts of Ukraine that were in the Soviet Union, traditionally parts of Russia, were stolen from Russia, and they deserve to be back in Russia. And so this is a constant stream. This is every night they get a dose of this, every single night. They also get a lot of lies and falsehoods about NATO troops on Ukrainian soil. They claim that there's NATO, all sorts of NATO involvement, which we all know is not taking place. There's been firm limits in the West of what we've done and what we've provided and can't provide. Certainly, we've provided arms systems and funding. But you listen to the Russian news, and it's all about, NATO troops on their soil, already NATO troops firing weapons, NATO heavily involved in this war. This is a NATO war with Russia. So it's discouraging, because when you watch those sorts of stories and that steady stream, you wonder, is there any hope for the Russian people really to understand what's actually going on? That their country invaded another sovereign country. They're to blame. And of course, a lot of that, Suzanne, we can talk some more about this if you like. It's their intelligence services. It's their line of the war. It's what they fed at Putin's request to the Russian people. So it's the FSB in particular that's behind a lot of that.
Shawn, you just wrote a fascinating article that was published at the cipherbrief.com called The Kremlin's Kill List: Inside a Culture of State-Sponsored Murder. And what you talked about here was that Russian intelligence agencies have been executing defectors, dissidents, and rivals for more than a century, but that under President Putin, the practice has become both strategic and celebrated. That's quite a statement. And I'm wondering, like, talk us through the history of sort of state-sponsored killings, if you will. And most people in the United States, I don't think are aware that this stuff is still happening today. In the UK, they are. Because they see it much more in the
Yeah.
news, and
Right.
Russia's been more active in UK soil and going after dissidents. But kind of frame the threat for us a little bit, and then talk about how this culture has benefited President Putin.
So again, Suzanne, I was a Russian history major. That was my focus. And you go back hundreds of years. The czars were not innocent either in repressing the Russian people, but their traditional form was to exile dissidents and revolutionaries to Siberia, let them languish there in Siberia. Even a lot of the revolutionaries, like Stalin, he wasn't killed. Stalin was sent to Siberia as a revolutionary. But that practice changed, as I mentioned in the article. Bloody Nicholas II, after the 1905, attempted revolution, which was sort of stopped with reforms. He had to agree to have a Duma and other reforms. Nicholas II and his secret police called the Okhrana, which just means guard in Russian, they started a retributive wave of assassinations against dissidents. So much so that when the actual 1917 revolution took place, many of the main figures who would later become the leaders in the Soviet Union, remember, they were abroad at the time. Lenin had to be brought back in a train, the famous sealed train, to the Finland station. So a lot of these they were exiled, they were outside of Russia because Bloody Nicholas was assassinating all of them. So when the Chekhovs was stood up by Felix Dzerzhinsky, Iron Felix as he's known, headed the first security service for the Soviet Union, he and the other leaders took the example of the Tsar's secret police and they took it to a new level, Suzanne, in terms of repression of the people, standing up even more vast gulag system, camps all over Siberia. That's in fact when it became known as the Gulag. The concentration camps they set up, they were the model for the Germans' concentration camps. The SS, this is all history, this is documented. SS visited Soviet Union when they had a very brief alliance prior to the start of World War II. So they became masters in having a repressive security state. And assassination was always a part of the regime. I give the example in the article. Stalin wanted Trotsky dead. It wasn't enough that Trotsky was outside of the Soviet Union. Stalin wanted Trotsky dead, and he used Roman Mercator, the famous assassin who infiltrated Trotsky's inner circle and killed him with an ice pick. Then it's important to see, what does the regime do? Do they acknowledge it or not? Of course they did. When Mercator finally made his way to the Soviet Union after serving time in prison, he's decorated as hero of the Soviet Union. There's the incident I mentioned with the Bulgarian dissident that the KGB, we know, again, documented from Cold War history, they provided the famous ricin pellet on the in the umbrella that the Bulgarian security service used against Georgy Markov in London. And so you're right. A lot of this still happened elsewhere, Suzanne. So Americans aren't as aware. So part of my goal with the article is to make aware that this is a tradition. Of course, this very week, as you know, the Sergei Skripal findings in the UK, that the GRU was conclusively behind that attempted assassination of Sergei Skripal and his daughter. And unfortunately, it resulted in the death of an innocent British citizen when the GRU, members of Unit 29155 that you mentioned, they recklessly threw this perfume bottle that they had used, just threw it out and left it for
It wasn't full of
poor British
perfume. It was
citizens.
full of Novichok,
Yeah,
right?
it was for Novichok. Yeah, it was
Poison.
filled with
Yeah.
Novichok. Again, a state manufactured toxin, Suzanne, as I make the point in the article. The Russians wanted the world to know this was them behind. They thought they would kill Skripal, and they wanted him to know that. And the example, as I discussed in the article, that they've been saying for years, it's part of their culture, is the Vysshaya mera nakazania in Russian, which means the highest form of punishment. So if you're an enemy of the regime, remember you can expect the Vysshaya mera nakazania, the highest form of punishment, meaning death, which is what everyone knew in Soviet times. That meant dating back to Stalin's purges of millions of Russians and other peoples of the Soviet Union. So this is a state tradition from the Soviet Union that Putin has made sure is a part of Russia today. It's one we need to be focused on like a laser and not forget it, because, of course, one final point, Suzanne, they're only emboldened when we don't react. When Alexander Litvinenko, the FSB defector in the UK, when he was killed by polonium, again, no mistaking, polonium has to be provided by a nuclear state like Russia. They wanted the point to be made. We got him. We killed him. And the West's reaction, the reaction from the UK and the United States was stunted at best. We hardly did anything, let's be honest. So we have to respond forcefully.
It's a very dramatic way to kill someone as well, because I was working as an anchor at CNN International at the time. And so internationally, the headlines were all about this man who had been poisoned, who was dying a very slow and painful death. So you've got the message, if that's truly the intent, that President Putin wants to send a message of strength and a warning to other dissidents, you've got it broadcast on the media that's going around the globe every night. I assume that's part of the plan.
Yeah, it's, you know, I mentioned in my book, chapter 9 of my book, I know we'll talk about it a little later in the podcast, but I talk about special operations and the Russian intelligence. So there's a number of these now in recent years, literally dozens and dozens now, assassinations. One of the more recent ones, the Ukrainian helicopter pilot, Suzanne, who defected to Ukraine with his military helicopter. The Ukrainians tried to warn him, please stay here in Ukraine, we'll keep you safe. He wanted to live free and chose this country, wanted to live in Spain. Well, the Russian assassins took him out. They killed him. When Dmitry Medvedev was asked in a press conference, famously, you know, about the incident afterwards, he didn't make any attempt to say, "Oh, I don't know what you're talking about." He said, "Well," his quote was, "A dog deserves a dog's death." So they're not shy about affiliation. The example I gave in the article you mentioned, you know, Vadim Krasikov, FSB bodyguard to Putin, who killed a Chechen separatist in Germany, broad daylight, captured immediately. He was the number one prize Putin wanted back in that spy swap last year, Suzanne. He wanted to show his services. If you murder for me, you kill for me. What did he do to Krasikov? Literally embraced him with a barricade on the tarmac. Wanted the world to see, this is my guy. He did it for me, for President Putin. It's really an unprecedented level of acknowledgement of a murderous regime, and we should call it as such.
Shawn, we know this has been happening in the UK. Is it happening in the United States too, but just staying below the radar, or is it not happening? Is President Putin a little bit more reticent to carry out operations that are this bold in the US?
Well, that's my worry. As I said at the end of the article for the cipher brief, my concern is that it's escalating, Suzanne, and that if we don't act more forcefully in our response, you know, if we in the West aren't united, that it's only going to continue to escalate. Now, there was open reporting. Of course, I'm only commenting on what I see in the press from open source reporting about the attempt from the Russians to kill a defector here in the U.S. that was reported on in Florida, you know, a year or two ago. So I think that in the absence of stronger measures from the West, that's what we risk. And I know that you have Dave Pitts and others writing on gray war and in the gray war zone. So every incidence of sabotage, of attempted assassination, like the CEO of Rheinmetall in Germany last year, which the Germans have conclusively, they believe it was a GRU behind it. When we don't respond in the West, we allow the Russians to think they'll get away with it and they can escalate and they can keep doing it. So that's my worry, is that it's already happening to our allies, which is horrible. The only thing that saved some of these targets is that the Russians failed. They carried it out poorly. It's only a matter of time, I think, until it's here in the United States. But whether they've attempted it or not, I only know what we're reading and seeing in the press, that apparently there have been attempts.
Russia's very good at operating in that gray zone, Shawn, as you know. So who really does know what
Yeah.
accidental deaths, aren't actually accidental? It's interesting that you mentioned the plot against the CEO of Rheinmetall, because Rheinmetall is very engaged with Ukraine as it has worked to defend itself since the full-scale Russian invasion. So that was the first time that I can remember anyone going after a CEO in the private sector, and someone sort of that stature. Was that kind of a shift that you're maybe also worried about?
Yeah, that's why, you know, I mentioned that example in the article, because I feel like it's another level of escalation. So they take a company that's known for being, you know, behind some of the arms that are shipped into Ukraine, and they're helping the Ukraine war effort, and so they target the CEO. And then there's the question, as we also delved into in the article, you know, that I covered, Suzanne. Of course, the ultimate question: how much of it is personally on the orders of Putin? In the case of the defectors, I shared my opinion, my personal opinion. I should say it for this whole podcast. Everything I share is my own personal opinion. It doesn't represent CIA or the U.S. government. I forgot to say that earlier. But my personal opinion, I believe Putin personally orders the killing of defectors. from the intelligence services in particular. I believe it is from his personal order because he was director of the FSB. I think he takes that personally. You can't use Novichok, polonium. These are state manufactured toxins and poisons requiring the apparatus of the state. So I think he orders those directly. Now, in the case of the CEO of Rheinmetall, I'm sure the Germans are digging very hard for that. The UK just said conclusively they believe Putin was behind it. He bears personal moral responsibility for what happened. So, yeah,
Shawn, I was just going to say, you mentioned something else in the article, and folks can go read the article at thecipherbrief.com. Again, just a reminder, it's a fascinating article. But you mentioned two things: murder by order. So I would assume this would be more difficult to prove unless you had sources, which you wouldn't be able to talk about, who were close to the president, or murder to impress the boss. What's the
yeah.
difference there?
Yeah, so here's what I think may be at play, Suzanne, when I mentioned that. You know, the Russian intelligence services, I comment a lot on this in the book, they're inherently corrupt. They function a lot like mafia families. They really do. All three of the main services, the SVR, the Foreign Service, the FSB, the Internal Service, which is the largest, and the GRU. They're heavily reliant on patronage networks, corruption, schemes, and scamming at every level, much like mafia families. Well, that's why I make the analogy in the article, much like mafia families, where you have to sometimes pull off an act of murder to win your button for the mafia family. I think, unfortunately, it works the same way in the Russian intelligence services, whether it's murder or it's pulling off a major sabotage operation. How many of these does President Putin know about personally? Ultimately, as you said, that's up to our intelligence services to know. I don't work at CIA any longer. I have no direct knowledge, but I do think that one of the things that's probably at play are these plots to impress the boss. That you have very ambitious members of the FSB and GRU in particular, in the case of these sabotage operations, like the rail line that was blown up in Poland. How many of these are actions by aspiring, ambitious members of the GRU or FSB that are putting together plots? And whether or not he ordered them directly, Suzanne, I think what Putin most likely has done, again, my personal opinion only, is that he's allowed a culture within the Russian security services where he said, yeah, let's find ways to hit back strong at NATO and the United States and make them think about their support for Ukraine. So that's what I think is ultimately at play here. Whether he orders it directly or it's by implicit consent, Putin has set up the field, as you were, that this is happening.
When you mentioned mafia families, and there's been a lot of talk over the years that if something happened to Putin, or he's getting older, if he eventually dies of natural causes or something, who would follow in that family? And there's always a lot of concern when that question is asked, because there's not a real heir apparent, according to the people that I've talked to. And the person who they worry about stepping into that role might be maybe more of a wild card, if that makes any sense at all. Can you kind of explain what that mafia sort of structure looks like around Putin today, and how worried
Yeah,
are you about what comes after Putin?
yeah. So within Putin's immediate ruling circle, they're called the Siloviki, which in Russian just means strongmen, and they're all heads of the respective what the Russians call organy, the organs of power, which are the FSB and the other security services. Preeminent among them, some of his closest in his inner circle, is Alexander Bortnikov, the head of the FSB. Bortnikov, I mentioned in my earlier article for you all, a cipher brief about the failures of the intelligence services in the Ukraine war. Bortnikov and the FSB had a huge role in the planning. Their fifth service, which was once headed by Sergei Ivanov, another member of the inner circle, the Siloviki, former minister of defense, now on the Security Council. The fifth service was behind a lot of the planning for the war. They provide analysis to the president. They're the ones that told President Putin this will work. So all of these cronies, Bortnikov holds the rank of major general in the military. Sorry, excuse me, the highest rank, colonel general in the Russian military, although he's never been in the military. So all of these Siloviki are potential successors to Putin. Ultimately, Suzanne, nobody really knows. I think there's another variant. I just read an article from the National Interest by about from a couple of years ago about potential family members like Anna Putin, who's Deputy Minister of Defense now. Could she potentially be a successor? Check the National Interest website for that article. So ultimately, I think we don't know. I'm sure this is something that CIA leadership analysts. I'm sure they must be looking at it. I think the most likely successor, though, is probably somebody like Bortnikov, head of the FSB, which is the role that Putin himself had, or Ivanov, Sergei Ivanov, who also was Minister of Defense and longtime member of the Siloviki. Here's the bottom line, Suzanne, what you already hinted at with your question, which is a very good one. Will we be better off? I'm not convinced. Unfortunately, these are all also men that are beholden to the corrupt regime and repressing their own people. So unfortunately, I don't see freedom on the cusp for the Russian people, um, whenever that plays out.
I want to talk about your book in just a minute, and I'm really hoping that one of the areas that you really delve into in your book is Putin himself. I mean, I for years, because I've covered Russia throughout my various journalism roles over the years, have been just fascinated by how one man can build such incredible power, such incredible loyalty, and really strike fear. How has he been able to do this? What does Putin have that others around him don't?
Well, Putin. So the subtitle of my book, of course, Tradecraft Tactics and Dirty Tricks,
Comes out in
Russian
April, right?
Intelligence, and yep, Putin's Secret War. So he's in the title of my book. I do share some anecdotes in the book, a little bit about his life. One of them I share is, Putin had this, and I mentioned in a recent review I did for AFIO on a book, I mentioned Putin's reverence for a GRU illegal, fictionalized hero in the 1960s series of novels. Um, this Stierlitz was a GRU illegal that Putin had a reverence for as a boy. He read these novels by a writer named Yulian Semyonov. And so Putin has talked about this a lot himself, that, he grew up not very well off, even though his grandfather, I guess, had been cooked to Stalin. Putin's own father came back from the war, I guess, injured. He had a difficult time. Putin shares a couple anecdotes that are interesting from his upbringing. One of them was him claiming that he lived in such a poor neighborhood, there were rats everywhere, and he was cornered by a rat one day. Putin's told this story in reference to NATO, trying to warn us. He said, I learned very early on that, if the rat comes at you, you have to charge back at the rat. That's a story he's told. He's also told the story of Sterlitz, this fictionalized hero, an illegal in the military, the equivalent of the GRU during World War II, who managed to fight back against the Nazis. And he said that inspired him to join the security services. Well, here's where the myth starts, though. Suzanne, I know something about the Soviet Union. I'm married. My wife was raised in the Soviet Union. Spent a lot of time in that part of the world serving for the government and getting to know people. Putin fictionalizes and mythologizes the security services as the elite of that society that helped the Soviet Union to achieve such great things. Well, what everybody knows who grew up in the Soviet Union was the system didn't work. It was completely corrupt. So that's the lie behind Putin's kind of mythology about himself and the elites of the security service that he's kept in power, all of them who have built literally golden palaces to themselves down in the Black Sea. I think it's telling his mentality. I don't think he can even be honest with himself. I think the stories that he tells are all very geared towards presenting that mythology about the elite of the security services, the Chekisti and the Razvietchiki, the Razvietchiki intelligence officers, and that having such a heavy meaning in today's Russian society. By the way, Suzanne, one quick point. All movies and TV right now in Russia, it's all about the security services. It's all about the elite of the FSB. It's all about the great missions they pull off. Well, what about, I posted some articles on LinkedIn. What about their grand failures? Crocus City Hall attack in 2024. They didn't protect the Russian people. Those attackers got away, by the way. They didn't listen to the warnings the West tried to warn them about. So I think a lot of it is fiction and mythology targeted to the Russian people.
Yeah. Shawn, why write the book? Who do you want to read the book, and what do you want them to understand that they wouldn't before they've read it?
Yeah, so I make the point. I'm very proud of some of my former bosses and senior leaders at CIA that have endorsed it, and I think they've read it. Mike Solik, our former deputy director of operations, very well respected, was a former boss of mine and all of us. He wrote the foreword to my book, and he makes the point that we Cold Warriors, even separated by a generation. So Mr. Solik is a generation ahead of me at CIA. But he said, we Cold Warriors, I was a younger part of a different generation. We understood, we knew Putin for what he was. Most of the American people might not have understood Putin and the culture of the Chekisti, the security services. That's what my book is about, Suzanne, sharing 10 chapters on the actual tradecraft. Here is how Russia carries out its secret war against the West. Very proud to have the endorsement of some other Cipher Brief experts, Rob Dannenberg, Paul Colby, Jennifer Eubank, all have kindly endorsed the book. I'm honored to have them on board in the team effort. This is not a memoir. This is all about the Russians' tradecraft. Very little about CIA tradecraft. When I was getting the book cleared by CIA, I had to make sure to document. A lot of it is out in the open press already. They allowed me to share some anecdotes and stories from my own career working with Russian agents and debriefing intelligence officers from Russia that have helped us on our side. I pay tribute to several at the end of the book. So that's the goal of the book, Suzanne. The goal of the book is to educate and inform about the threat from Russia and to share very specifically in fine detail about how they carry out their espionage operations and their hybrid war against the West. That's what it's about. I hope some of your viewers and listeners will consider a pre-order. It's available on Amazon and all the big sites right now.
And the title of the book again is
Tradecraft Tactics and Dirty Tricks, Russian Intelligence and Putin's Secret War. It's out in April, but available for pre-order now. So thank you for letting me talk about it some.
Shawn, do you look at the headlines every day today now and look at the way that Americans are turning on each other, often fueled by things they find in their social media feeds, really divisive threads that are picked up on? Russia has long been seen as sort of an expert in operating in this gray zone space. And there are lots of parts of gray zone, but in this one particular instance, on the disinformation mission, do you worry that more Americans really need to be educated about kind of tactics and what their goals are, and how if you're naive and you don't know, you're going to fall right into the trap?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Suzanne. That's such an important question. I really appreciate you asking it. So, Russian active measures, called активные мероприятия in Russian, but the other term they use are measures of support. What are they supporting? They're supporting their malign influence in the West against their adversaries. So, active measures, I put in my book the KGB very definition of them are information operations meant to support foreign policy and other objectives of the state. And so I offer the examples also in my book, other writings that I've done. The record is quite clear what the Russians try to do by meddling in our election. And by the way, I'm completely apolitical in my book. I don't talk about any U.S. presidents one way or the other. But the fact is, the Russian goal with their meddling was to undermine our democracy and the Americans' trust in its electoral system. That was the goal. And unfortunately, to a degree, they succeeded, because there is a lot of confusion and there is one of the examples I point to consistently in my writing is look at what Facebook found out itself during the 2016 election. For instance, Facebook's own investigation and the DNI report and the Senate Select Committee intelligence report, all of which were bipartisan, by the way, all of which nobody argued about it back when they came out. All of those pointed to the fact in Facebook's own investigation that Russian trolls during the same meddling operations, sometimes down to the same minute, they were arguing on both sides of debates on social media. So their trolls, for instance, the IRA, Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, that Prigozhin headed when he was still alive before he was killed by Putin as well, speaking of assassinations. Prigozhin's group, what were they doing? Those trolls were meddling on different sides of these debates, some of which they had fostered themselves for the American people. They had picked a topic, and you name it, that tends to be divisive, and their trolls went in and meddled. There's a great book by Thomas Ridd about active measures that I cite in my own book that goes through all of this. Cyber operations and the cyber platforms, social media, Suzanne, have amplified Russian measures in the gray zone to a level heretofore never seen in democracies in the West. So that's the danger. That's what they're doing to the American people. I hope we're more aware of it so that we can stop it. That's one of my goals, why I wrote the book.
Yeah, I don't think you can look at Russia through a political lens in America and think that you really understand the threat. There are a lot of Republicans in Congress, Roger Wicker, Lindsey Graham, who have been leading sort of the narrative that Putin is not your friend, and I think have given very interesting and believable explanations as to why. As have you, Shawn Wiswesser. It's such a pleasure to have you in the Cipher Briefs Expert Network. I feel like our goal being very apolitical is to educate Americans on the context around how these threats do impact them. And having you as a part of this team means a lot to us. So I want to thank you for taking the time to visit with us here on the State Secrets podcast. And we definitely look forward to reading your book, Shawn, in April. For those who don't want to wait that long, like me, you can find Shawn's writings at thecipherbrief.com as well. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Susanna. It's an honor, and it's an honor to be writing for Cipher Briefs. So look forward to more of our collaboration ahead. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast.
Likewise.
Appreciate it.